College football nerds, we are here talking Ohio State. We're talking Clemson. And look, we said Ohio State was going to be in the playoffs, and we said last week if they made it in, they were going to be the 3 seed. That's where they are. So we're going to get nerdy and talk about it. Josh is here with me, of course. And let's just dive in. Y'all know, like, subscribe if you haven't already. But this is the playoffs. If you are watching us in the playoffs, checking out our computer model, then you are already liked and subscribed, I'm sure. So your homework for this video, as we get into it, is give us your score prediction, and we will mix it up with you. All right, Josh, I was having a back and forth today on the Twitter sphere, and somebody was talking about what I thought about Ohio State and Northwestern and all that. And the thing that's come clear to us, and I know it's us and you agree with me because we're already talking about it, is we're big time. Ohio State belongs in the playoffs. They're one of the best teams in the country. But our concern is that Ohio State has got a good bit of rust. And there's a lot of people in SEC country and even around the nation that are like, look, Ohio State doesn't belong in the playoffs. They played 6 games. It's not fair because they can rest their guys. They can avoid injury like we saw with Alabama against Florida, losing their center for the season. But the counter to that is they haven't had enough opportunities to get everybody in sync and to see what kind of play calls they would call in foxhole situations, to adjust off that and learn how their guys react when things get tough. They haven't had enough of those opportunities, and things just seem really rusty. I want you to talk about that in context of this game where Clemson is, given how many games they've played, and just to get into this so people have a proper understanding of why this whole thing about Ohio State being fully rested and it not fair that they're in the playoffs is actually working more against them than for them.
People want to sort of rag on a team for any reason they can. That's always been my experience. And anyone's looking for any excuse to look at a team in the playoffs that got to a position they wanted to be in and say, this is why you're there and why we're not. First, Ohio State wanted to be playing more games this season. They wanted to play more football. It's not their fault that Michigan raised the white flag, figuratively and literally, I think, in your score sheet that you made one time for that. And, you know, they kind of got stuck in this position. I think there's an advantage for a team when you have longer to prepare, right? When you get a bye week and the other team doesn't, somebody can't, that stuff helps. You know, if you got an easy opponent when another one has a hard, and then you play each other. But Clemson and Ohio State found out at the same time that they're playing each other. They have the same amount of time to prepare. The only difference is that Clemson's played twice as many games as Ohio State. The point I had made to you when I was trying to analyze like where these teams were at, effectively going into this game, Ohio State is at the same point Clemson was going into the Boston College game. And as a Clemson fan, I think you know Boston College, Notre Dame, into Pittsburgh, there were a lot of facets of the team that kind of rounded the corner, particularly defensively, but all around the team just started playing better. And yeah, they won a lot of those earlier games by large margins, but like, you know, the Syracuse game or the Boston College game in particular, that was a struggle for a while. And then they kind of sort of got in gear and turned it around late. And they weren't consistent for 4 quarters. And the difference the past few weeks is that Clemson has played good football for 4 quarters. That's what late season teams do in a way that early season teams tend not to do. I think it's a serious disadvantage for Ohio State that they are at that mid-season point effectively for Clemson. And they are healthier than teams around the country are. Clemson's gotten really banged up over the course of the year. Now that's always funny to me too. Like Alabama fans complain that they lost Jalen Waddle. Well, Alabama fans lost Jalen Waddle. It was like the 4th or 5th game. They'd already lost Waddle by the time this came around. They haven't. Funny thing is they haven't had many injuries until this past week with their center until this point. So that's all a little overblown. I know you get banged up. And the last thing, and I was going to say, and we were talking about this beforehand, I think to the coaches and players that are in it, they sort of get in the mindset of, man, this is a grind. It's tough. You don't know how hard it is. Man, what an advantage it is to not have to do this for 10 weeks, to only have to do it for 5. I'm so exhausted. I get it when you're in that situation. And I know I'm an outsider saying this, But I think maybe it's a little deceptive because I think the reality is just because it's exhausting and it's a grind, I'm not sure it necessarily makes you worse. And you'd really prefer not to have to go through 10 games, but it doesn't mean you're at a disadvantage in the next one. In the example I gave, and I've hinted this a couple times, I'm an attorney, and I studied for the bar. The bar exam is a grind, and it's like 2 months of studying, and you study like day and night for like 6 days a week. 4 or 5 weeks in, I was exhausted. I did not want to study again. Studying was really hard. I don't think I studied worse though the next week, the 5th week, than I did the first week. I was probably in much more of a routine at that point. And even though I felt it sucked and I didn't want to have to do it, it didn't make me worse at doing it. And I think that's the problem, is even if you want to talk from the grind aspect, Ohio State has had a lot less time to gel, a lot less time to figure things out. And the grind, as much as it sucks, I don't think the grind Clemson's went through actually negatively impacts them in truth in terms of who's going to win this game.
Yeah, and this is, what we saw Saturday was, out of necessity, Trey Sermon went ham on Northwestern's defense, and it was a great sign because, and it's funny because, somebody on Twitter came at us and said, well, if Najee Harris did this, you'd be all over him and blah, blah, blah. We were telling Ohio State fans the second Trey Sermon transferred from Oklahoma, look out for this guy. We were really high on him at Oklahoma. Actually looked good in 2018 against Alabama. We were on him. So I don't know where that came from. I just want to point that out. We were telling y'all. So, but my concern was that they had to do that because Justin Fields was floundering. And I think this is twice we've seen him now against two good defenses really struggle. And again, we know he's a good quarterback. We know he's going to go probably second quarterback off the board. Why is he struggling? He's struggling because there's just this rust going on because they're not getting into that continuity. So I want you to compare this a little bit, because we've talked about this so many times, to the 2018 Alabama team that just destroyed everybody they played until Georgia in the SEC championship game. And it was really to their detriment that they didn't have any of those foxhole games. Talk about the things you learn in those situations and how you kind of want to be tested before you get in the playoffs.
Alabama in 2018 ran into a brick wall, or buzzsaw, or however you want to put it, with Clemson. And look, you got to give Clemson a lot of credit for that performance and what they did. And we had a whole breakdown video on it. And we talked about a lot of things, right, about what went wrong for Alabama. And what was fascinating is that Alabama hadn't really had any blips resembling that season outside the game where Tua was really banged up and he's trying to throw in a bad ankle. The thing that struck me was that if you could take away the receivers, Alabama didn't really have a plan B. If they weren't being able to hit the shots downfield and the RPO schemes, and I felt like I saw a lot of that from Ohio State. I felt like in the Northwestern game, those downfield shots weren't open, and they didn't quite know what to do, whether to run or pass or lean on the run, and the balance was shot. I think there's two things that maybe we should unpack a little bit. The first thing is Ohio State lost a lot of receivers from last year. They had a lot. I know the guys weren't super high draft picks, but they had a lot of good veteran receivers. And Olave and Wilson are good players, but Olave was out, and at this point, I don't know if he's going to play or not for the Clemson game, though it looks like they're going to shorten the timetable and he's probably going to play. That's not 100%. But without the receivers getting wins, which they struggled, and that was the same thing with Alabama and Clemson. The receivers were not having clear wins one-on-one, and they didn't have the shot. And the other thing is that Northwestern played a very bend but don't break defense and then stiffened up in the red zone, which was a carbon copy of the strategy Clemson used in that 2018 game, and we've referenced several times. So maybe we can sort of unpack those two different factors in the game.
Yes, and that's look, Trey Sermon got however many 300 yards or whatever he got, and that was great. But in total, I think Ohio State got 400-something yards, which is not great. Northwestern was dropping their secondary and preventing the big play, and they're saying, look, I will let you have everything in between the 20s. And that's what Clemson did to Alabama. They let them have everything in between the 20s. And I think Tua put up something like 320 and 8.5 yards per attempt. It was actually pretty good numbers. But once they got in the red zone, they're having to settle for field goals, or they're having to go for it on fourth down because their defense wasn't performing. And that's what Northwestern did to Ohio State in this game. Now, just to turn it back to you, like, how much of that is just having Olave out? And you did mention losing the production from last year. I was high on KJ Hill. Like, I love him in the system he's in now in the NFL. I think he's going to be productive there once, maybe Allen leaves and he gets to be the guy. But, like, I love him at Ohio State because he was a steady guy that you knew, like, on third down, I need 7 yards, I can go to him. How much of Saturday that we saw, and Clemson, I want to pause here for a second. Clemson, we're going to get into you and how you throttled Notre Dame and how we're excited about that. I just want to unpack this a little bit. How much of what you saw Saturday is remedied by the fact that they get, let's say they get Olave back for Clemson? Do you think, because I do feel like if there's the main guy is gone, it can throw everything out of whack.
It remedies a certain part of it and not another part of it. And I feel like that was a terrible answer. But what it fixes is the short, the rollout passing game, which they really struggled with in this Northwestern game even. That short, efficient stuff is where Olave thrives. He is a very clean receiver. I don't know how high he's going to go in the draft, and I know some Ohio State fans are going to probably bristle at that. Wilson has a higher ceiling. I feel like Wilson, when he graduates, will be a better receiver than Olave will be as his senior year. But what Olave is very consistent, and he's a really good security blanket that finds a way to get open. I think that'll fix a lot of stuff underneath, but Olave is not the high point guy that is going to beat bracket coverage. And what I mean by that is a Justin Ross or Kyle Pitts against Alabama. Pitts made a touchdown catch between three guys, and he did it because he's 6'6". Olave does not have the physical tools to do that. What he is equipped to do is to beat single coverage, especially underneath or in the intermediate game. And I know he's caught plenty of bombs, but he is a reliable guy to catch bombs when they're not dropping players and they make a bust, or you get him to overcommit to the run and he gets over the top. That's the RPO stuff. If you're playing the RPO without dropping, he's great. But if you drop and he's in coverage downfield, I don't know that he fixes that. Wilson is probably the better player in that scenario. And, Ohio State had some issues with this last year with Clemson, and maybe that's where you turn it around to Clemson a little bit. Northwestern's a really good defense, but how well is Clemson going to replicate it? And I'll throw a number to you that you probably haven't seen. So our model talks about percentage of opponent averages allowed. And I'll be curious to hear your response on this. Does this surprise you? Clemson this year is allowing 69%, and there's a Kyle somewhere in the back laughing, 69% of opponent rushing averages. Northwestern, going into the Ohio State game, was actually allowing 92% of opponent rushing averages. Does it surprise you about Northwestern? One. And two, do you think that's significant about Clemson's ability to follow the strategy in this game?
Well, I think a couple of things. Like, we touched on it in our Northwestern Ohio State preview, that Northwestern's giving up 6.5 yards per attempt, which is wild. Like, that's a crazy number, pass attempt. For me, I don't think Clemson's defense in general is as good as Northwestern's. Yes or no, do you think Clemson's defense overall is good as Northwestern's?
Overall, no.
And that's not a shot at Clemson. That's Northwestern's defense is really freaking good. And Clemson fans, go back and look, 6.5 yards per pass attempt. That is wild. The problem, and we've touched on this a little bit over the years, Ohio State plays a lot of teams in the Big Ten that play really good defense that are so inept offensively that they cannot take advantage of getting stops against Ohio State. Clemson can. And that's where this game turns, in that if Ohio State doesn't come out clicking on offense, Clemson is going to be able to turn those stops into points. And I think that what we're going to see Saturday is, or Saturday, I'm in the like week to week games. What we're going to see in this game is where Northwestern got a stop and then a 3-and-out and had to punt and give Ohio State the ball at midfield. Clemson's going to get a stop, maybe not a 3-and-out, but they'll get a stop and then drive the field 70 yards and get some points. And it's going to put pressure on Ohio State's offense, and they're not going to be able to just run the ball. The flip side of that, though, is, Clemson's not as good in their pass defense as Northwestern, so maybe that opens things up for Justin Fields. In your opinion, would you rather have the elite shutdown defense with the mediocre offense, or the elite offense and if you have to, you can win a game 52-46 like Alabama?
In the modern era, I'd rather have the elite offense, and this gets into the defensive thing that I tried to throw you a T-ball, and I'm going to let you try to hit it again here in a second. But the thing to me about Northwestern, and we talked about it in the preview, Northwestern was a really great pass defense. 74% of opponent passing averages, as you said, 6.5 yards per attempt allowed. That's phenomenal for a season average. And they were actually a really average run defense going into that game. Pass defense, we've seen in recent years in our modeling, is really hard to limit. I'm gonna pull up real quick the model from last year's game with Clemson and Ohio State. So Clemson and Ohio State were 70-75%, both of them, in opponent passing defense percentage. Like, they allowed 70-75% of their averages. Probably the two best pass defenses in college football at the end of the year. Ohio State, obviously, Chase Young in that defense, 2 first-round picks at corner, and in a phenomenal pass rusher, and you still allow 75%. Again, the same Northwestern did, or was allowing going into the Big Ten championship. And that's just because you can stop the run, because it's, you can load bodies, clog the line, and the run stop schematically. But in the RPO world, where the safety can't keep on the defensive line, they can't read run pass, because if you do that, you get burned over the top. You've got to play flat-footed. And if you're playing flat-footed, you can't really do a good job. So nobody is doing better than 70% of your average. If you're a 10-yard per attempt team, the best anybody's going to hold you to is 7.5, which is still a competent passing game. You just don't shut people down on average. I mean, maybe you have a good game or they have a bad game like Fields did, but it's really uncommon. So if you have an elite offense, and especially if you have an elite passing offense, that's going to translate. And no matter how good the other defense, no matter how good it is, it'd be the top pass defense in the country. And people want to rag on Georgia, but quite frankly, they were the number one statistical defense when they played Alabama. It didn't flipping matter. Alabama was still going to get their 40 plus. Of course, they lost a ton of guys to injury, and they're not the same team they were. Different story, but that was sort of exemplifying that it's almost pointless to have an elite pass defense. And then what you saw from Northwestern was their run defense was very average, drop guys, and if you have a completely average run defense and drop guys, you're going to give up 10 yards per carry. But the pass defense was good enough to not give up the big play and then to hold point in the red zone, and that held points. But even then, I think a truly elite passing offense is going to get there.
So I know you're trying to get me to indicate, like, hey, Northwestern had to concede the run to stop the over the top. Clemson has this great statistical run defense, and so they don't have to sell out to stop the deep pass because they can stop the run in normal, and they can comfortably keep things in front of them. Although last year, J.K. Dobbins went ham on this Clemson defense. And that's what Ohio State fans are going to say. Is they're going to if he doesn't get hurt in that game, we probably win that game. So for me, and it's hard to model, but like, Josh, what do you think in terms of like Clemson's statistics within their regular season versus what we saw them do in the playoffs last year? Is there an opportunity here for Ohio State to actually produce well, or is it that if you don't have that pass game clicking, you're not going to be able to run the ball? And that's one of the reasons why Ohio State could run last year against Clemson.
Yeah, I mean, J.K. Dobbins was 9.67 yards per carry in that game, 18 carries. I think they did the same strategy last year, to be honest. I think that was kind of their goal. And we talk about Northwestern being successful, right? In the example is Northwestern gave up 6 points in the first 3 drives. And yeah, there's a turnover, but it's not coincidence that you got down in the red zone and then things kind of stalled. People have argued back and forth. I personally think it really wasn't so much run pass. Now, they were too pass happy in the red zone, but even the runs weren't going for 12 yards per carry. They had to run it a couple times to get a first down, and they were getting a first down every carry against Northwestern. It was very intentional. Clemson probably would have given up too many points with Dobbins had stayed healthy because he was consistently letting them get enough yards. And I think that's the point, is that like 2018, that Alabama game, Najee Harris was like 6.5, 7 yards a carry, something like that. But you've got to do it a ton. You got to get like 10 of those in a row without a negative play. And Clemson's this year, the defense isn't necessarily completely stout. Brazzi and some other guys have shorted up, but they still are better at disruption than necessarily stoning you. But ideally you get enough to get it down the field, but you got to do it a ton. I think they're just good enough to do that. And I don't know that Sermon is quite J.K. Dobbins in terms of just being able to consistently get through the first tackle and always have positive yardage. The problem, though, I think for both these teams is I don't think either one of them is as good in the secondary. And we haven't even touched on that. And it's probably the last thing, we should really mention. This year, Clemson's giving up 93% of opponent passing averages and Ohio State's giving up 105. And I already told you it was 70 and 75 last year, and now it's 93, 105. Very average versus elite. Do you mind if I go ahead and touch on the model and just give the score?
No, I think you should touch on the model. I'll give a caveat here for people who are curious. This is very hard to do. So like modeling, for example, we just went through this with Alabama, Florida, and Alabama fans in the Notre Dame preview. Alabama Florida model had it 48-43, ended up being a 6-point game, 52-46. Model was great. We don't know with the Alabama Notre Dame model how good that's going to be because of conference isolation this year. So, as Josh talks about the numbers, big old fat caveat, we don't know because there's been so much conference isolation what 93% of opponent averages or 79% of opponent averages actually means when we start playing across conferences. So with that, Josh, let her rip.
Yeah, and the two analogies here. One, understand this is basically saying, based off how you did in the ACC and based off how you did in the Big Ten, assume the conferences are equal. This is what it looks like. The model doesn't have a single mathematical data point to correlate them. I don't inject an external factor like recruiting, so it's literally assuming the conferences are equivalent right now. And I always give the analogy. It's like if I gave you a shot of a peak in the Himalayas and a snapshot of a peak in the Alps, and you just see the mountain, the mountain peak and it's snow covered, and I ask you which mountain's taller. If I don't know where the base of that mountain is and how they relate and where they start, you don't know. And the Alps may look taller than the Himalayas, and you've got that little snapshot because you've got no frame of reference. And that's what the model is absolutely dealing with 100% right now. But in terms of just base, how they've done in conference play, they have been purely average by ACC and Big Ten standards. That difference makes this a high-scoring game. Last year, our model was pretty darn good, and our score predictions were good. I think it's one of the better ones we've done in a while. It had Clemson 28-27. I ended up picking around that, and as I recall, I think my score I picked Ohio State, you picked Clemson. You were more accurate on the actual margin and who won. If Ohio State had gotten the last touchdown pass, I believe I was either a point off or would have the exact score. And regardless, the model having in a date-even game was great. But this one's expected to be a couple touchdowns higher. And it's really due to that pass defense numbers being much worse, like 50% worse than it was last year. Clemson's coming in 8.5 yards per attempt. A little surprising. That's not really an elite number. That's merely a good passing offense. Going into last year, it was about the same, though. And you saw how that turned out. Ohio State, 9.3 yards per attempt, but it's been very hit or miss. But it's thinking, about 6.8 yards per play for Clemson, about 6.1-ish for Ohio State. That comes out about 43-34. When you go from 6 yards per play to 7, it's not a linear thing. It's not like you get a point per yard or a point per tenth of yard per play or something crazy. It's more about how that affects efficiency down in distance. And 3rd and 3 is a lot different than 3rd and 4, right? And our model is basically saying that edge puts Clemson in a much better position to consistently get first downs and to get chunk plays and score than it does Ohio State. But it definitely thinks this is at 43-34, a much higher scoring game. Both teams averaging over 8.5 yards per attempt. And it really thinks the secondaries and their lack of an ability to completely slow down the passing game is going to be what decides it. And it definitely thinks Ohio State's a little bit more susceptible to that, I should say, than Clemson is.
And I've struggled with this on what to do from a score prediction standpoint. I think right now, because of the COVID situation and how rusty Ohio State has looked, that Clemson and Alabama are a good bit better than the field. Like, there's a Clemson-Alabama gap, then Ohio State, Notre Dame, A&M, then another pretty sizable gap. Part of me feels like we've seen glimpses with Ohio State where, like, if they can turn it on like the Michigan State game, then all bets are off, right? But I've seen too much of the things that concern me, especially in the passing game, which requires the most in syncness. It's a word, look it up. In syncness, and is the most affected by something like time off and not having the ability to know what plays to call in certain scenarios and how people will react. And with Olave out and coming back, like, I hope he comes back. I'm going to go ahead and give my score prediction. Initially, I thought something pretty sizable, still kind of sizable. I'm going to go 37-23 Clemson, which is bigger than the model. I think we're not going to see the real Ohio State get this game. I hope we will. I don't think we will. And I think most of it is going to be attributed to the fact that they just are in two different seasons right now. Clemson is rounded out in form, played a ton of games. Ohio State has not only not played nearly as many games, but they've had to start-stop. And I think that's just too much to overcome. 37-23 is what I got. Tell me what you got.
I've got 41-24. I agree with you. I think you talk about where Ohio State, and I mentioned, right, the way this model is working is it's saying this is you relative to your own conference. I don't think the Big Ten is anywhere near where the ACC is right now. That gap from number of plays, games played, and continuity is big. And I may be wrong, and it may turn out that the extra time and practice and cohesiveness to go against one opponent negates a lot of that. But I really think it's a big factor. There's a lot of other stuff that comes into play, right? If Olave is out, if Justin Fields' injury that he hurt his hand right in yesterday's game, we're recording on Sunday, if that's more significant than we realize right now, that stuff could all make it worse. I think that's going to surprise people how much that actually shows on the field. I will say this, though. I think Clemson's going to have to work for it a little bit. I'll tell you the thing that is really, I don't know how to handle. And I don't know how to handle it because there's no external data points for these conferences and all that kind of stuff. Indiana with Freifogel really killed them. Over 200 yards receiving by Freifogel in that game. And then some other guys that have not been very productive killed them with Penix. And they killed them on shot plays. Penix is very inconsistent as a passer. But what he does is he can hit any throw, but he hits it about 50% of the time. But he'll hit 50% of the time anytime, right? Like anywhere on the field. But even the short stuff he misses. Lawrence is a lot better at that long stuff. And I don't think Clemson is nearly the receiving core they were last year. That's shouldn't be a huge statement with Higgins and Ross not deep. But they've still got enough in Rodgers and Powell. And then, they had some other guys come on, EJ Williams in that last game. I think they've got enough to really threaten them, and they've got a quarterback that is on at doing that if you screw up deep. So I think a couple glitches in that game at some point, probably second to third quarter-ish, they're going to give up some cheap points. And, once they get a 14-point, 20-point deficit, it's the same thing that happened to Alabama in 2018. That let's just run and grind it out and get down the field and then try to score. You get a little panicky. You start trying to throw more than you should, and you start going for it on fourth down on the red zone, and that's what makes this like a 20-point margin. And I'm a little worried about it being worse than people even realize. I kind of hope I'm proven wrong and this is a more competitive game. But I think Ohio State, through no fault of their own, is just at way too much of a disadvantage from the lack of games played.
Yeah, and like I said, we might see glimpses of the Michigan State game or the first 3 quarters of the Indiana game, where and Indiana has a great defense too. So in that regard, at least Ohio State has faced some good defenses. But so the potential is there. But when you're backfilling really just a ton of production, like a KJ Hill or like a Chase Young, like guys that went on to the NFL, when you're backfilling that production, you want the full spring practice. You want the full season of games. So these guys aren't even like the freshmen and the new faces, the new sophomores that didn't start last year. These guys would have been far more seasoned under normal circumstances, and they're just not. And Clemson is a lot more senior in that regard. So I don't see it being a win for Ohio State, but they're talented enough, and I love me some Ryan Day, so I would not be surprised if this is a game. That's it for us, y'all. This one went super long. We had a lot to talk about because we're kind of bringing the whole season into view for this game, so we had a lot to talk about, and apologies that it went long. It was so long that we thought about breaking it up in 2, and we didn't end up doing that. But let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be. And if we're off, that's fine. Just back it up with data, and we'll mix it up with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.